I'm delighted to follow David Sloan Wilson, who I admire as a scientist who's actually got his hands dirty in terms of taking his ideas into the field, his city, and trying to make life better for the human beings who live there. I confess I don't do that. I'm still described on my CV, I think, as a theoretical psychologist. And so I'm going to give you a bit of theory, actually, not so much of the theory as Charles said I might have given you, not the 3-hour talk, but I'm going to at least give you part of that in relation to the material David's talked about. What I want to talk about tonight is the hidden influences in the environment, the things that get to us, and without our knowing it, change the kind of people that we are, because we've evolved to respond to cues from the environment in ways which, in the past at least, would have been highly adaptive. But I'm going to start with a story. A few years ago, I was in Botswana, in the Okavango swamp, staying in the camp of Dorothy Cheney and Robert Seyfarth, baboon camp. And we were sitting at the table, and the vervet monkeys were up in the trees. They hang around the camp. And Dorothy Cheney came rushing out saying, "Where is it? Where is it?" I said, "Where's what?" She said, "Where's the leopard?" And what she'd heard was the vervet monkeys giving an alarm call to a leopard, which was one of the things which Dorothy and Robert had studied earlier in their research careers. Well, there wasn't a leopard in sight, so we looked around and we looked under the table and where else a leopard could hide, but there wasn't one. But there was one sitting right on top of the table. My guidebook to the animals of Africa had a picture of a leopard on it. The vervets up in the trees had seen this picture and responded to it as if it was a real leopard. It was obviously, this is an instinctive response built into them. They, in some sense, couldn't help themselves from responding to this unreal leopard as if it was the real thing. Now, of course, there are no picture books in the environment in which these vervets had arisen, and so, of course, nature hadn't designed them to avoid responding to these trick representations of things in the environment. Now, you may think we're not like that. Humans surely don't respond in these kind of instinctive ways to things which actually are not what they seem to be. Well, do they or don't they? Let me tell you of an experiment. How about this? Here's an experiment done a few years ago by a colleague of mine, Melissa Bateson, in which she looked at how much people put into the honesty box, the box for taking the coins which you paid for your coffee in the laboratory she worked in. And in two conditions, on top of the honesty box was one picture of flowers and the other a picture of eyes. Well, the data there speak for themselves. In fact, when there was the eyes were present, people ended up by contributing twice as much for their coffee as they might have, as in fact they did when there were no eyes present. They didn't notice the eyes. No one commented on this, but instinctively they were apparently responding to a cue from the environment by changing their behavior. Now, you may think that's in a slightly artificial situation in a lab, responding to paying money into a box for your coffee. They repeated the study in the cafe and looked at the amount of litter which people left behind after they'd had their lunch or their tea. When there were two notices saying, "Please remove your litter after you've left," in one case, there were some eyes involved. In the others, there were just flowers. In the case where the eyes were there, half the number of people left litter on the table. And yet, again, nobody noticed that they were responding to this cue from the environment. So we're not so different from these vervet monkeys. We do respond to things which are out there in the environment, and they change our behavior. Now, recent research in social psychology has been uncovering a huge number of these covert influences. They've come to be known as priming effects. It seems that wherever we go, we're being pulled this way and that by influences which we don't acknowledge, but nonetheless are getting to us and changing our personality and our attitudes. Some years ago, a famous book, of course, by Vance Packard, talked about the hidden persuaders. He was talking about the use which advertisers make deliberately of cues to change people's behavior in order to make them buy products. But now I think we should be talking about something, Vance Packard was talking about deliberate attempts to change our behavior that had been designed by human designers to affect us. But the reality is that we're responsive to hidden persuaders of quite another kind, ones that have been designed by evolution. We've been designed to respond to because at some level, in the past at least, it was highly adaptive. And I think that as we walk through a city now, yes, of course, there are these commercial advertisements, but there are dozens of other influences affecting us in good and bad ways, which have never been designed, which nobody intended, but nonetheless are getting to us and changing the ways, the kind of people that we are. Indeed, a city like Manhattan, I'd say, is indeed more like an enchanted wood, in which we're being pulled by the nose, changed about in the way, the kind of people we are by influences which we hardly notice and yet respond to in major ways. Now, I'm going to talk about quite a few examples of these priming effects, but I want to open by talking about one very extraordinary new example, which I heard about only a few months ago at a conference in Japan. And you'll see why it's particularly related to David Sloan Wilson's stuff he's been talking about. This is some work by a group in BMWGuggenheim University in Japan. What they did, and I'll describe the experiment, and you'll see, I couldn't believe my ears when I heard it, but you'll see how, in a sense, it makes such sense. What these researchers did was to give subjects, they had to play a game in which they were competing, well, sorry, they weren't competing, they were having to decide whether or not to cooperate with a partner whom they couldn't meet, who was on another computer somewhere, and they had to decide whether or not to cooperate or to defect in a prisoner's dilemma game, a game in which if you cooperate, you both win out collectively together, but if he defects and you cooperate, you lose. If you defect and he cooperates, you gain. If you both defect, you both do rather badly. And obviously the best outcome in this situation is for you both to cooperate, but if you mistrust the other partner, you should probably defect. You shouldn't cooperate. Now, you'll see in this setup, there's another computer in the background there, one which they hadn't had their attention drawn to. On that other computer, I should just give you here's the game. If you both cooperate, they get 200 yen each. If they both defect, they get 50 yen each. And you'll see the other contingencies. If one defects and the other cooperates, they get 400 yen. But the best solution overall is for both to cooperate. Now, in the background, apparently irrelevant to the situation, was this other computer. And on that other computer were two different displays. There are two alternatives. In the background was either a little animation showing cooperation or a little animation showing apparently non-cooperation. What happened? The subjects who had in the background the cooperative, the one in which the little figures were helping each other, they showed a huge amount of cooperation on their prisoner's dilemma task. The others in which the background symbols were hindering each other showed a huge tendency to defect and not to cooperate. Well, it was doubled, the change, the cooperation in the group which had at the corner of their eye seen this little symbol of bulls apparently cooperating or not cooperating. Now, it seems that just as, the leopard puts up the wind up the monkey, just as the eyes bring out responsible behavior in us, it's clear that tokens of a cooperative environment bring out the nicest side of us, even if we don't acknowledge that we're seeing them, even if we, this is really below the surface, something which we did not deny was having any effect on us at all. And almost certainly, it's instinctive. We know from the studies on infant behavior that infants at 1 year old see one pattern as being cooperative and the other as being mean in the relationships which are involved. And it's an astonishing fact that these apparently innately based attitudes of recognition of cooperation or defection can change our behavior in such dramatic ways, except that it's not so surprising if we think in David's terms, because of course, as David has explained, it's just what we should expect from our evolved nature. We've evolved to look for signs of trustworthiness in our environment, and we're going to be sensitive to whatever signs are there. Indeed, signs which seem to be so simple and so elementary that we'd hardly even recognize them at an intellectual level for what they are. In fact, David's group, he hasn't talked about this himself. They've actually found evidence of community perception, in which people recognize symbols in the environment, different environments, as conveying evidence of trustworthiness or not trustworthiness. People who see the picture on the left and are told that they're dealing with somebody who comes from that environment as against somebody who comes from the environment on the right. These were, of course, there were many other examples given in their experiments. People who play a game with people from the left are more likely to defect and not to cooperate. When they think they're playing with somebody from the right, they believe that they're interacting with a trustworthy person, and they will be more likely to cooperate. David's group have shown that the cue here is simply the amount of disorder in the environment. Disorder seems to act as a very simple prime, telling us either we're in a situation where we can trust people, where the expectation is that this will be a cooperative environment where we'll get the return for whatever we give to them. In a disorderly environment, we subconsciously assume that we're involved in a cheating, uncooperative environment. Now, that's these priming effects, of course, are not just about cooperativeness or responsibility. And I want to mention some other recent findings about how people pick up unconsciously on cues from the environment. I'll run through a lot of them, rather random, because at the moment the research does seem to be so random, but that's part of the point I want to make and to address in my later remarks. Here's one example. Jean Nouvel designed a wonderful pavilion in the Serpentine Gallery in London, the Red Pavilion. Well, what happens when you're bathed in red light? It turns out that it has very surprising influences on people's behavior. You might have guessed they become more amorous, they become more anxious, they become more stupid. A surprising finding. If you actually ask people to solve anagrams in that situation when they're bathed in red light, they make 30% more errors than they would do if they're bathed in blue light. Now, what's going on there? I've said these are going to be random results. What happens if you put a charity box at the top of an escalator as against the bottom of an escalator? Well, when we go up in the world, it seems that literally we become more generous-minded. At the top of an escalator, people donate at twice the rate to a charity box, or they give to beggars begging with a begging bowl at the top of the escalator than they do at the bottom. Somehow people feel elevated, more in more high-spirited. I mean, well, it's in in a spirit of more superior moral position at the top of the elevator. Another example: what happens when we see or smell garbage? Well, one very interesting fact is that we respond by releasing antibodies into our bloodstream, as if to defend ourselves against the infections which we might get. But we also, for example, we guard against other sorts of infections. When people are asked about their use of condoms, whether or not they would actually, in general, engage in safe sex, in the presence of garbage or even the smell of garbage, they apparently dramatically increase their intentions to use condoms. But it goes further than that. They become more moralistic in other ways. They become more critical of other people. And in the presence of rubbish, we actually judge other people much more harshly in comparison with ourselves. Another strange result. Supposing you pass a poster which is ostensibly about oranges, but mentions the word Florida on it. And psychologists have looked at people who've been exposed to the word Florida, and they've measured the speed at which they walk away from the advertisement. They walk more slowly after they've been exposed to that word Florida. Somehow, Florida has got to them at the level of reminding them of retirement homes and old age, and people begin to slow down and to consider themselves somehow of having entered the third age. These results are so surprising that, I mean, as everyone comes out, people can hardly believe the story. But here's one which I think we can believe the story, and we've known about it for some time. When we see women, here's a poster, in fact, in Allen Street, across the road there. When we see women portrayed as sex objects, then if we ourselves are women, our intelligence drops. If there's a poster of a woman as a sex object on the wall in the context in which women are taking exams, their scores dramatically go down, particularly on mathematics. And in fact, all it needs is for women to be asked to put their gender at the top of the exam paper, and that itself reduces their scores on mathematical tests. These priming effects are getting to people in ways they don't acknowledge and which at the moment psychology has very little understanding of. I'll run through these quickly. If you are holding a cup of hot chocolate, then literally you warm to other people whom you're dealing with. And if you're interviewing somebody across the table and you're holding the cup of chocolate, then in fact you feel more well disposed towards them, and you tend to think of them as being more likable and more gifted than perhaps you would have done otherwise. Here's another example. If you are interviewed, take a survey within 100 meters of a funeral home. Nobody reminds you of where you are and that there's any reference to funerals, but then you're asked about your political attitudes. It turns out that if you're in the presence of this reminder of death, then your attitudes become notably more conservative. For example, you're much more likely to become anti-gay and pro-life, anti-abortion. And here's a final example I'm going to give you, which I have to tell David this because of his particular book. Imagine we read a story. In fact, this is an experiment. People were read a story, which was about going out on the town night, and the story is identical in both cases, but in one case, the final words were, "The city was mine." In the other case, the final words were, "The city was ours." And after that, the subjects take another test. They're asked to name what letter they're looking at. The people who had the story that ended "the city was mine" say they're looking at an F. The people who were told that heard the story that the city was ours say that the letter is an S. Kahneman, who reported this, said, I don't believe it, but I have to accept the evidence is out there. These very minor effects are changing whether, for example, in this case, we think globally or we think in terms of particulars. And I mention this in relation to David's work particularly because again and again in his book, he says, my city of Binghamton, using evolution to improve my city one block at a time. And perhaps David should, in fact, take a leaf from this book and change this to improving our city one block at a time. Well, this is all very exciting, but how to make sense of it all? These do seem to be random findings. Just as with cooperation, it's clear that we can begin to understand that. These are almost certainly adaptive responses which made sense in our past environment. But there's very little theory to pull them together. And in the short time I've got, I'm going to try and give you a theory. This is a lab, and perhaps it's appropriate, this is the first time that this particular theory has had an airing. It's going to take us a bit away from the psychology of cities, but I'll get back to that. I arrived at the theory I want to present about what's going on here through researching a very special case of priming, namely the placebo effect. You know about the placebo effect. A sugar pill, the sight of a doctor, can dramatically improve our health. It can take away the pain, it can increase our immune responses and so on, even without the sugar pill having had any effect or the doctor yet having had any actual interaction with us, which would have produced a healing response. Now, this placebo effect is very important. It's an essential part not only actually of our interaction with each other and with potential medicines in the environment, but of course with medical practice as such. But it's highly paradoxical. As an evolutionist, I have to say the placebo effect seems to be quite bizarre. Because when our health improves under the influence of placebo medication, it has, of course, to be a case of our curing ourselves. But here's the paradox. If we have the capacity to heal ourselves by our own efforts, then why don't we just get on with it? Why do we wait for permission from a doctor or a pill that it's time to get better? That's the paradox of placebos. We're doing it ourselves, and yet we seem to not trust ourselves to actually get on with the job. Now, what could be the answer to that? The answer, I think, has to be that self-cure actually has costs as well as benefits. It's not always such a good thing to cure ourselves, and that's because actually healing has considerable costs. Immune systems are very costly. Letting down defenses like pain or fever and so on can actually lead to seriously bad consequences. And so we've been designed by nature to play safe and not to let down our defenses such as pain or fever, until we see signs from the environment that the danger has passed. We don't use up our stock of ammunition against illness until we know that there's not still worse to come. So what placebos do is to give us the belief that we're on the mend, the belief that we're on the mend, that we're in safe hands. In other words, we're using the environment environmental information to make a forecast of our prospects in life, and so to adjust how we deploy our resources for self-cure in the case of medicine. Now, in that case, of course, the paradox actually makes sense. But of course, it's because we're using information, even if it's false information, to change our idea of what's coming down the road and whether or not it's safe to cure ourselves. But this isn't just about placebos, and I think we should be thinking much more in general about what I've called a natural health management system. What this health management system does is to perform a kind of economic analysis of what the opportunities and costs of cure will be, what resources we've got in reserve, how dangerous the situation is right now, what predictions we can make about what the future holds. And so what we do is we take in the environment, in the case of health, we take in environmental information, the signs of injury, the risks of infection, the chances of medical assistance, what social support there is, what the weather's like, and so on. And we use that to produce a health forecast. And on the basis of that, we adjust our healing resources, our sickness behaviors, our defensive symptoms, the immune resources we deploy, our pleas for help and seeking of remedies, and so on. And so, in effect, this health management system is acting like a good hospital manager who has to choose if and when to throw resources against this or that problem, to hold so much back, to decide if it's essential to build up this area or that. Let me give you an example. Consider an immune response to a pathogen, for example. So we detect the pathogen and we mount an immune response. But mounting an immune response is expensive. It actually requires considerable metabolic output, and also it's difficult to replace in terms of the nutrients required for mounting an antibody response. And so we need to take account of what situation we're in. And indeed, when things are looking bad in winter, in bad weather, when starvation threatens, when resources are likely to be scarce, in fact, we reduce our immune responses. And we know this is a very real effect. It's why, in fact, colds, for example, persist in us much longer in winter than they do in summer. It's because we actually we don't dare mount such a strong immune response in winter. The opposite of that is that when things look rosy, when it's spring, or the weather's improving, resources are likely to be good, we actually see the sun and the flowers outside our window. In fact, our immune responses considerably increase. We risk getting better when we wouldn't have done otherwise. Or we can even look for other signs that we're in good hands and things are going to get better, and that's why the presence of a doctor actually increases our immune response. But of course, the same will be true even if that doctor is not a real doctor, even if he's a quack. And that's why the placebo response can occur even in response to fake information. Well, how could that connect to other priming effects? Well, here's the thing. It's this, that if this is the way we've evolved to manage our physical health, then there must surely be a similar story to be told about our mental health. And if we can tell the same story about our mental health, then perhaps it's how we manage our personality and our character as well. So, in fact, perhaps humans have evolved a full-blown self-management system, almost certainly evolved out of the health management system, with the job of managing our psychological resources put together so as to optimize the persona which we present to the world. That's to say, we read the local signs so as to forecast the psychological weather. We observe who's watching us. We notice what kind of environment we're in. We recognize whether or not we're in the presence of family and what their values are. We look at the stereotypes around us. We wonder about whether or not death or mortality are threatening. And out of that, we now produce a self-forecast about what we can get away with, what's politic, what's expected of us and of other people. And so we regulate our personality accordingly. So releasing or withholding resources, psychological resources, as I've put them there, optimism, conscientiousness, cooperation, courage, and so on. To give you an example of that, following on from that same model, if the environmental influence is that we're being observed, then we produce an increase in conformity. To take that other example, if the environmental influence is that it's cooperation, then in fact we increase our cooperativeness. Okay, so that's my model of it, my theory of how environmental cues are controlling the kind of person we are. But if that theory of these priming effects is right, how could we possibly apply these ideas to help improve our lives, and our lives particularly in the urban environments we live in? Well, we have to recognize that the self-management system and the health management system are both ancient adaptations, they evolved a long time ago, even if the self-management system evolved rather more recently than the health management system. They evolved, David's already shown us hunter-gatherers, under conditions when our ancestors were living very different material and social lives from those we do today. In the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, they were small scale. Everyone was known to each other. There was close monitoring of what everyone was doing. No privacy. Everybody was subject to being punished either by gossip or by actual real sanctions against them for contravening the social mores and so on. Of course, there were much greater risks of other kinds of violence and of disease and so on. Now, because our circumstances have, of course, greatly improved in the last 10,000 years or so, and yet the evolutionary catch-up occurs relatively slowly, it means that today there are bound to be things that humans couldn't risk doing in the past that they can risk doing now. As we saw above, placebo medication for the body works by tricking the subject with false information into believing the situation warrants a reduction in pain, for example, or the mounting of an expensive immune response. But it's precisely because our environment today is less dangerous than it used to be that responding to this trick no longer puts us at an unacceptable risk of curing ourselves before it's safe to do so. And that's why placebo medicine today can, in fact, be counted an unqualified boon. But now, of course, the same goes for the self. I think we should be able to devise placebo treatments for the self. That's to say, we should be able to invent environments which trick people into coming out from their protective shells and so emerging as happier, nicer, cleverer, more creative people than they would ever otherwise have dared to be. That sort of poster on the wall against the stereotypes, for example, you may be offended by my describing that as a placebo poster, but I do so because, of course, it represents not the real situation of a young black girl growing up in America today, but a possible one, an imaginary one, which nonetheless, by tricking the subject into responding to it as if it was real, can in fact be self-confirming. And I think we should think about developing placebos at every other level of the environments we create, developing placebo architecture, placebo schools, placebo religions, which will in fact encourage us to come out and be the people which we otherwise wouldn't have risked being, given that we're to some extent stuck in the evolutionary environment in which our brains evolved. Well, of course, we've been doing that for a long time. The cities, of course, here are producing the opposite of placebos in many ways. We could call them nocebos, taking away from our potential. But, of course, in the past, the cities for us, in villages which for us really worked so well, have all sorts of cues which encourage us to come out and be the kinds of people which we can be at our best. But what I want to say is that if we have a theory of this, we can analyze the environments which really work for us and begin to take some kind of scientific control. Thank you.